As of the time of this video, this was the last season of Symphogear ever produced, and for the foreseeable future, will likely be the final one.
I say this because it does seem like the IP is making a lot more money these days thanks to their mobile game X-Drive Unlimited, which was launched around the same time Axis began airing. And having played it myself, I can say it was an interesting game that unfortunately didn't last long here in the States. I guess it was inevitable, as it would have had a lot of competition from Genshin, Honkai, and even FGO just for anime gachas. Regardless, it does seem like they're making a lot of bank in Japan, as they're certainly pumping a lot of it back into a ton of collabs, so I can't be upset if they're kind of selling out, especially when a lot of the content, like the story, is legit really good.
In the future, we might actually cover some of the main story parts of these games, because believe me, there's some amazing stuff here. But for now, let's wrap up this franchise's television run.
For this review, we are going to send things off with a little more analysis and appreciation of the staff behind this franchise. As such, to prevent things from becoming a little too bloated, we're going to split things up into 3 parts instead of 2. Believe me, it's going to make all of our lives a little easier.
With that, let's take a look at Symphogear XV and see how good this swan song was. That hopefully didn't involve any sort of reddish eyes, if you know what I mean.
Covered in strawberry jam. Yeah, I'm sure that's what it is. Most important takeaway from this was they seemed to know Fine. Jumping back into the present, we're kind of just dropped into the middle of the action. I mean, yeah, we will get some explanatory flashbacks in just a bit, but still, it is a little weird just kind of starting us in the middle of the action, but then again, I wouldn't expect any less from this series.
This whole franchise in a nutshell.
They were trying to recover something called the Coffin from the Antarctic, though I think it was a little more active than whatever the Witch of Procrastination keeps in her bedroom. The gear users engaged it, and we got our first transformation sequence of the season, which of course went to the main heroine. Hibiki's sequence here was animated by Yoshitaki Nakakoji, who started off as a 1-episode key animator for GX, but after he proved his worth in Axis, he was promoted to an action director for this season, and of course this. The sequence itself was of course very impressive, being dynamically shot with a ton of angles, and just generally having a very Hibiki feel to it with a ton of Bruce Lee homages. Great stuff, especially seeing some of the huge ass weapons compressing into her usual regalia to overtly reference how this little girl packs a god-killing punch. Though the thing I really like about this, as well as all the other sequences, is here at the very beginning with them jumping to one side, calling back to the transformations from the first season. It's a nice way of showing how things have kind of come full circle with this franchise. Anyway, we then got the first action sequence of the season that wasn't animated by Nakakoji, he would actually start work in the next episode, but rather Koki Shikishi, who remained a constant presence throughout this franchise, especially during G and GX. And if their style makes you want to say aura aura aura, then yes, they also did a lot of work for Stardust Crusaders, and really seem to like their elemental effects, and of course, more and more Daka, which I can totally appreciate. Anyway, they seek to defeat the Coffin at first, but then it launched some sort of attack that led to all sorts of technobabble.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Well, I guess after all that action, I guess it was a good time as any for a little flashback to break things up. After Hibiki paid her usual academic dues because of all the superheroine antics, she and Miku went on a Christmas date, and just so happened to pass by the exposition used at 9 about foreign relations with the US.
About the only thing that's not over the top in this series is politics, because let's face it, nothing is going to be able to top real life.
Of course, this would become more important later, but first we had to subtly revisit a certain cliffhanger from the last season.
ああ、私が誰かを困らせてたら響はどうするの？
Okay, could someone turn on a light? I can barely see through all these foreshadows.
And I guess we were starved for some Michael Bay explosions, so they just blew up a boat. It turned out to be an incognito research facility where they were looking at the remains of Tiki, hoping to learn more about Adam's goals. What they did discover before she self-destructed was the location of the coffin in Antarctica.
まさか氷の下から何かが出てきたってわけじゃないよな。
So wait, that thing was the thing? God damn, I don't think even an army of Arsocoros could defeat that.
Actually, they found an extinct species of scorpion from the Middle East, tying it back to the Illuminati, so of course they needed to recover it. Being reminded of Mr. Expositionist, Hibiki thought back to his final words.
希望は今日に絶望しろ明日に未来に
Meh, don't let him bother you too much, Hibiki. This is the same guy who let his evil little sister totally wreck him.
Back to the present, the gear users were still KO'd, which gave us time to get to know our new antagonists of the season, who were former members of the Illuminati. Each of the Noble Red here had a motif based off of some of the central characters of Universal Pictures' Monsterverse, including the Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein's monster. Now, you might be wondering where's the mummy, but we'll get to that in good time. Anyway, after Frankenstein's waifu, Vanessa, said some cryptic villain stuff, we cut back to the gear users who got a little help, though surprisingly not from Genjiro and his thermal undies.
照明弾で棺の進行を停止。
女の子がこんな寒いところでお腹を冷やしたら大変だろ
Oh, good lord, the dialogue in this show sometimes.
Still, that weirdo simp's words were enough to defrost our heroines, and they managed to make a comeback, along with some help from a certain lowly homunculus.
Shouldn't that phrase take up about 50% of your vocabulary?
But yeah, a nice way of hinting at Elf 9 playing a relatively bigger part this season compared to her role in Axis. Anyway, after we got our daily reminder that the director of this show really liked working on Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, Hibiki managed to defeat the coffin using the Getter Cyclone because I guess someone has to show poor Poseidon at least some love. However, they still needed to finish it off with a pinpoint shot from Chris.
Girl, by any chance are you related to Akagi?
Regardless, they managed to defeat the Big Bad Monster with one last climactic and well put together team attack.
So, that was Symphogear XP, and even though that was pretty short, I gotta say, that was pretty good, and why do you mean we still got a whole series to go through?
Okay, but seriously, for our first episode, that was a pretty strong start, if a little disjointed with story, but again, that's kind of Symphogear in a nutshell. Still, considering how they had a hard time defeating their coffin, I wonder how they deal with the actual big bad this season.
俺がコストビオ
つまりは正解というわけですね。
Man, Scruffy has seen better days.
No, of course, this was the aforementioned mummy, though don't worry, in spite of that scorpion from earlier, we weren't going to get any horribly CGI Dwayne Johnsons. This led into the second episode, and the new opening, that, as usual, had an awesome Naomizuki-san Metanonia backing it, that was basically encouraging the gear users, especially Tsubasa, to be all that they could be as we were reaching the end. And to give this a little more feeling of finality, the animation reflected each of the things the gear users were fighting for, like Maria honoring her sister's memories, Tsubasa fighting for her family's honor, more on that in a bit, and of course Hibiki fighting for her waifu for now. This more slice of life half of the OP was directed by Satoru Fujimoto, who has been a character designer and chief animation director for the entire franchise. Though, while he could do nice subtle storytelling like this, we of course needed a little more punch for a show like this, so the second action half was taken over by Kota Fumiaki, who also designed the Alkanoids for Axis, and this season, yeah, don't worry, we'll see more of those funny grunts in just a bit. But yeah, clearly a lot of work went into this OP, including a ton of key animators who I don't want to just list off here, so please go look it up for yourself if you're interested. Because this was probably my favorite overall OP for this franchise, as it managed to cram in a ton of character work, along with a lot of good action within just a couple of minutes. Anyway, after the insanity of the first episode, we got something thankfully a little more down-to-earth and legit well-written stuff with the eternal best girl. As usual, not only was Chris a precious cinnamon roll tsundere, but she also had the strongest understanding of what exactly their line of work entailed, and how it would massively affect their futures eventually.
だけど、そろそろのんきに学校に通っているわけにはいかないのかもしれない。
I will never get over the fact that this character's VA has played 2 roles in Precure, and yet still hasn't played one of the titular heroines. Come on, Toy, get on that!
On a little side note, the second cutest thing in this episode was probably Maria and her poor attendant looking like a member of the Secret Service. Anyway, she gave us another flashback, though at least for the sake of the ebb and flow of this particular episode, it did feel a little more justified than the first one. Kirika and Shiabe were sent to protect the coffin from being taken by Noble Red, and this led into one of the most notorious scenes from this entire show, believe it or not, Kirika's transformation.
Whoa, 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 hey, 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 hey!
Fun fact, this sequence involving a 16-year-old essentially doing a pole dance was originally a lot raunchier.
Likely because they knew this was going to be the final season, animators actually got to choose which of the gear users' transformation sequences they wanted to handle. In other words, they got to choose which of their waifus they wanted to animate. In Kirika's case, it was Yoshiyuki Okubo who openly admitted Kirika was his favorite character. So, thankfully, after he was about 60% into his initial draft for the sequence, he recognized it was a tad bit too lewd, so he scrapped it and started from scratch, and yet we still ended up with this, and even then they had to cut another 10 seconds from the final animation to broadcast it, which I'd imagine a lot of it came from here right at the very beginning.
Now, personally, I do believe in artistic freedom, so long as it does take away significantly from the surrounding product. I will still give Okubo a weird look if I ever see him in real life, but that's just me.
Anyway, this episode also has 3 credited action directors, and while I can't say for sure who did what, I do think this first one was directed by the opening animator Kota Fumiyaki, who I noticed really likes his effect animations like lasers, as well as bringing out a lot of personality in his characters. Seriously, these two give Akira and Yukari a run for their money. And due to power creeping, the once mighty Alkanoids were sadly reduced to total jobber fare at this point, so the new villains had to step it up, starting with Wolf-chan Eliza. Her gimmick was utilizing attachments from her suitcase that plugged into...
just play a Quagmire clip.
Anyway, this next fight focused on Shiabe was likely handled by the aforementioned Yoshitake Nakakoji, who again really likes his dynamic angles that worked really well here at showing Shiabe and Kirika's 20th combination attack at this point. Also, part of this might have been animated by Fumiyaki because again, the guy likes his flashy effect animation.
Okay, seriously, I do think this is the Akiba Ranger season, where basically they just threw up their arms and said, "F it, let's just lampshade the hell out of these old cliches."
Anyway, Eliza retreated having failed her mission. Going back to the present, Tsubasa wanted her security to do a little favor for her, which of course turned out to be another concert, because come on, we can never get enough of Hikasa and Mizuki singing together. Kosuke Yoshida and Shota Sanomiya shared credit for this amazing scene, along with of course several other key animations across the franchise, including in the previous episode. And I think this was the first time they animated a scene like this, as the concert scenes are usually handled by Satoshi Hata, who's only going to do one key animation in the next episode. Again, I think this was just another case of just letting the animators do what they wanted, and hey, more power to them, especially if this is the end product. Though personally, I do prefer Hata's animation as it focuses more on the actual dancing rather than the big spectacle here, but hey, spectacle ain't bad either. FY, my favorite concert remains G's just for those stupidly huge and overcomplicated sword mics. Unfortunately, the rest of the gear users were running late due to traffic, which meant they were missing the concert as well as the noise attack.
Yeah, maybe I should have had just a few more safety precautions than what we even have nowadays.
The final action director for this episode was Hiroyuki Takashima, who was still relatively new to this franchise. I think he only joined the crew at the tail end of Access, And wow, is it a pity he came in so late. He seems to be the type that puts a little less detail into the character design consistency, but in exchange we get much more fluid and dynamic action scenes. I guess it also helps that he ended up doing a lot of night scenes, so you can't even really notice the inconsistencies, but still a lot of credit where it's due. Anyway, as usual, there was a ton of civilian casualties, which understandably brought some PTSD in Tsubasa that was a little different than previous seasons where it was more about her waifu.
As while coming to terms with Kanade's death was probably more significant and definitely more personal for Tsubasa, that didn't mean that everything else just went away.
Hell, ironically, that survivor's guilt might have even been further amplified after getting to know and becoming good friends with one of the few survivors of that event, as it gave perspective to the people she needed to protect, and ultimately failed to in this case. This was only further gaslighted by the vampire idol Millark. She explained how the Noble Red were actually on the lower tiers of the Illuminati in terms of power, but that also meant that they were a lot less merciful. This ended up leaving Tsubasa open to a future plot point, ending this amazing second episode on quite the high note. Well, okay, there was actually a little more after the credits, as the American scientists examined the mummy.
Okay, who forgot to turn off the microwave? Was it you, Gary? Because I swear to God.
Continuing right on from there, the Americans tried to research the bracelet the mummy left behind. But who cares about all those damn politics? We got confirmation of something much more important in the next scene.
おじさんとおばさんたち、結局まだ一緒に暮らしてないの?
Of all the retcons I've seen in my life, this is probably one of the greatest.
And yeah, I know what's going to happen with Akira later in the season, which we will discuss when we get to it, but honestly, it's a much better call to have Hibiki's mom not just instantly forgive her deadbeat husband. Broken family dynamics like the Tachibanas can't just be fixed instantaneously, so I do like, amongst all of the insanity in this franchise, they at least were treating this subject matter with a degree of maturity, while also tying it with some other storylines. Good stuff that I think more than likely was thanks to the one other writer of this franchise, Shingo Nagai, who, yeah, almost sounds like the creator of a ton of super robots.
Up until Access, Akifumi Kaneko was the sole writer of this franchise, and while I won't totally discredit his visions, as I still really like the writings of the first season, I have to admit, he did need a little help, at the very least, with his character writing.
As I've said previously, I think certain character motivations and arcs were often all over the place in G and GX when he was a little too focused on the grandiose set pieces. Maria took a little while to win me over, and Akira was a definite failure in mine and many others' books. Thus, I wouldn't be surprised if Kaneko originally wanted to bring Akira back for Access, but the higher-ups and Shingo Nagai convinced him otherwise. Nagai himself is still a relatively low-key writer. I mean, he has written for stuff like U-Game and Bullfree, but at least from my viewpoint, he hasn't had a real breakout credit just yet. Regardless, if he was responsible for this scene, as well as typing up some of the scripts for Access, then major praise should go to him. Anyway, the Noble Red made some deals with some shady dudes, while also foreshadowing some of their motivations kind of cleverly. However, their transactions have been seen by some stereotypical street thugs who needed to be silenced. So they gave chase with their noise on
You know, stuff like this is exactly why I decided to split this up into 3 parts. My sanity can only handle so much in one go.
Anyway, they killed off 2 of the randos, and would have finished off the last one had Hibiki and Chris not arrived. The aforementioned Koki Shikiji animated Chris's transformation sequence here, and just as he did when animating most of the battle of the first episode, he made it particularly flashy and full of Daka, including freaking funnels.
But who cares? She could turn into the super arm tank. The only thing that really matters is that one little detail. So, did they include it?
You have chosen wisely.
Action direction for this episode was credited to Toshiharu Sugie, a little bit of a lower tier animator for this crew, at least compared to some of the previous guys. Thus, this had a little less dynamic movement and camera angles, but also a lot more consistent models, plus points to anyone who likes to put in some good gun kata. During the fight, Millar confirmed that the Ignite modules had been disabled after the events of Axis, meaning that they didn't have their deadly but powerful upgrades. That said, the Gear users' new base forms were still play strong, forcing the two to retreat after we got to see a little more of the vampire's obvious mind manipulation powers. They managed to get away, but our protagonists did retrieve the goods they got from the Shady Guys, which were...
ケチャップ、この季節にバーベキューパーティーとは敵も去るもの引っかくものです。
Okay, y'all really shouldn't reduce your jokes down to my crap.
But yeah, they were wondering why they would want a rather rare type of blood, as well as who their dealers were. At first, they suspected the American government, but that theory was quickly and literally shot down by Frankenwaifu. She had recovered the bracelet, which upon further inspection looks a little familiar.
Well, at least this series is going to know when to end properly, for the most part.
Tsubasa also recovered around this time, but she probably would have stayed in bed if she knew she would have to deal with her grandpa dad. And as usual, he gaslit everyone around him, and oh, I wonder if these sword symbols poking out of his head that look like horns are meant to symbolize something. Later, Kirika and Shabe theorized when the Noble Red might attack again. Figuring that the vampire wanted blood, Kirika proposed her showing up at a hospital they just so happened to be nearby, which of course was absolutely ridiculous.
Symphogear, the series that often just says, ah, f it, just throw it in.
The two tried to do a meal arc on their own, leading into Shirabe's transformation sequence, done by Yosuke Kabashima, who's been a chief animation director for this franchise since the very beginning, including the original OP. These days, he's probably better known for his work on Axel World and the fake Grandor Camelot movie, which I'm really looking forward to checking out. Still, going by the former, as well as his work on Gravion, he has done a lot of work on mech stuff, and has also animated magical girl transformations, most notably Cure Sunny. With that in mind though, how would he approach the much girlier Shabe?
Yes.
Okay, Chris, never mind, you've been overthrown.
I mean, if anything, I wasn't expecting a full-on figure skating routine outside of a JRPG opening. Anyway, this fight was arguably the better of the two of this episode, even though bits of it do make me feel a little uncomfortable for some reason. And ultimately, the two defeated the vampire with another creatively insane combo attack, this time taking a page out of Bart Simpson's book. However, Frankenwaifu came in with a save with an EMP, forcing our heroines to help the hospital, while the NR got away with the goods. The episode ended with the big shocking reveal of who the big bad of the season was gonna be.
What a surprise!
Oh, so you mean to tell me that the gaslighting, xenophobic, NTRing, nationalistic zealot was a bad guy? Yeah, and this guy's totes a common rider of justice.
I mean, okay, I'm actually not at all against Grandpa Dad being a villain, as at least he is a little more straightforward with how much of a giant piece of crap he is, and he will continue to garner good heel heat as opposed to, oh god, would you please stop chewing the scenery already? And if anything, at least he's not as wishy-washy as some of the writing for the Noble Red, who were featured in the next episode. Using some more technobabble, they managed to seemingly unlock the powers of the half-infinity gauntlet. However, before they could test it, Grandpa Dad had them deal with the guys from the last episode, who he wanted to give some permanent pink slips to.
Yeah, after everything y'all have done, those words ring more hollow than a Precure toy.
One of them did try to go out fighting, but I guess he forgot to say that he was Iron Man. I mean, he still would have died, but hey, at least he wouldn't have gone out like a little bitch. Anyway, that explosion caught Song's attention, prompting the arrival of Hibiki and Maria. This last transformation sequence we'll cover for today was handled by Hanyu, and no, not that one. They joined this franchise mostly during the latter half of GX as an animation director, and not too surprisingly, did a lot of animations for Maria. And while Shirabe got figure skating, I guess Maria got gymnastics.
Well, I would certainly watch these girls compete over anything for the Olympics nowadays.
But anyway, while still having a relatively small portfolio, I do think Hanyu is one of the upper tier animators of the show, as I do like how they focus on giving impact to every character's attack without an over-reliance on flashy effects. Actually, for this scene, I think it was directed by Nakakoji, which, more than anything, I wonder if it included this.
I've already referenced Go Nagai a lot. Oh, I know. God, God, do I miss that show.
Frank and Waifu also spelled out their motivations here, and I'll discuss that more in a future part, but I will say now that stuff like this is a little heavy-handed.
だって人は異質な存在を拒み隔てるものだもの。
That's unfortunately true, but I do think they tend to reject mass murders a lot more, just saying.
But again, Symphogear writing in a nutshell when they try to write complex villains, but kind of throw a little too much at the wall at once in my opinion. Anyway, Vanessa managed to buy enough time for her allies to escape, however, not without having a tracking device stuck on her. Later, we got some more good seed playing for later when Song picked up on the music they used to activate the half gauntlet, and realizing the urgency of the situation, they went to the Noble Red's location at that one toy quarry.
Okay, y'all do get a few extra points just for that.
Yeah, as it turned out, they found the tracking device and had planted a bunch of mines beforehand. Moreover, they had another trick up their sleeves, the power of Tetris. Well, actually, it was essentially something like a reality marble from Fate, even having been based off of a mythological figure in Daedalus and the labyrinth he created to trap the Minotaur in. Though, unlike Asterios' noble phantasm, this could also be used as an actual attack. Things look grim, but fortunately, over the course of this episode, Hibiki had been going through a bit of a main character arc, trying to come to terms with what she learned from Saint Germain and her own ideals of justice. And honestly, yeah, it did feel a little rushed, as I think even the creators knew they were kind of retreading some familiar ground with this character again, but at least it was short, and it did lead to an awesome duet with the Ghost of Saint Germain. Yep, the spirits of their former antagonists had provided them with some spiffy new forms. We'll talk more about these next time, but for now, let's just appreciate some more Shikishi-directed action that in any other season would suffice for a final battle. I mean, generally, once Hibiki goes in solo and gold, that's almost always the sign that the season is ending. And again, as a JoJo animator, Shikichi puts a lot of emphasis on the over-the-top superhuman choreography, if that makes any sense. Great stuff that unfortunately got cut short when Song got called off by the Japanese government.
Like, come on, what sort of government just randomly sends out some riot troopers and Oh right, we did just kind of watch a minor pole dance, didn't we? Yeah, see you guys for part 2, hopefully soon.
FBI, open up!